I've been thinking about something that comes up again and again. Sometimes quietly, sometimes late at night, sometimes almost as an afterthought. People will say things like, I don't know why, but I feel exhausted after seeing them. Or, the conversation was fine, but I needed to lie down afterwards. Or even, I enjoyed catching up, so why do I feel flat now? And what's interesting is the confusion underneath those statements. Because nothing bad happened. No argument, no drama, no obvious tension, just a conversation. And yet, something shifted. I think most of us have been taught that tiredness should have a clear cause. Physical work, emotional upset, stress, lack of sleep. But this kind of tiredness doesn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. It's quieter than that. It's the kind of tiredness that makes you want silence. The kind that makes noise feel like too much. The kind where you don't want to explain yourself anymore, even to people you care about. And often people don't talk about it because it sounds ungrateful. They think, I should be pleased I saw them. I should be fine. I shouldn't feel like this. So they dismiss it. But the body doesn't dismiss it. The body remembers. I remember someone once telling me about a family lunch they'd gone to. They described it as lovely. Everyone was polite, food was good, conversation stayed light. And yet, when they got home, they sat in the car for 10 minutes before going inside. Not because they were upset, because they felt emptied. They said, it's like I left part of myself at the table. That stayed with me. Because that sentence, I left part of myself there, explains this experience better than any technical term ever could. What I want to say very clearly at the start of this conversation is this. If you feel drained after certain conversations, you are not imagining it, and you are not overreacting. Your system is responding to something real, even if it's subtle, even if it's hard to put into words. And the reason it's hard to explain is because we're not taught to notice how we participate in conversations, only what is said. Let me ask you something gently, and you don't need to answer out loud. Have you ever noticed that with some people, you don't really breathe properly while you're talking? You might be smiling, nodding, listening, but your body feels slightly held, almost like you're bracing. Just a little. That alone takes energy. Let me ask you something gently, and you don't need to answer out loud. Have you ever noticed that with some people, you don't really breathe properly while you're talking? You might be smiling, nodding, listening, but your body feels slightly held, almost like you're bracing. Just a little. That alone takes energy. Or maybe you've noticed this. With some people, you can ramble, you can pause, you can change your mind halfway through a sentence, and it feels safe. But with others, you choose your words more carefully. You edit yourself as you speak. You soften things. You add explanations. You make sure you don't sound too much, too intense, too quiet, too anything. That editing is invisible, but it's exhausting. What often happens is that people blame the other person or blame themselves. They think they're draining or I'm too sensitive. But the truth is usually more nuanced than that. It's not about good people or bad people. It's about how much of yourself you feel able to bring into the space, and whether the space allows you to stay whole. This becomes especially noticeable as we get older, when we've done more inner work, when we're less interested in performing, when we've outgrown certain roles. Conversations that once felt fine can suddenly feel tiring, not because anyone changed dramatically, but because you did, and your system no longer wants to split itself to keep things comfortable. So if you've found yourself lately thinking, why do I feel so tired after social things now? Why do I need more recovery time? Why do some conversations feel heavier than they used to? That's not regression, that's awareness. And today we're not going to judge that awareness or rush it away. We're going to listen to it, because it's trying to tell you something useful. When people start noticing this kind of tiredness after conversations, the first thing they usually do is try to explain it away. Not out loud, internally. They create a story, and most of these stories sound reasonable at first, but over time they quietly make things worse. One very common story is, I'm just too sensitive. People say this almost casually now, as if it's a character flaw they have to live with. They'll say, I know I'm sensitive, so I suppose that's why. And on the surface that sounds self-aware, but underneath it is a subtle dismissal, because what they're really saying is, this reaction doesn't deserve attention. So instead of listening to their tiredness, they push past it. Another story sounds like this. I should be able to handle this. You might recognize that one. It usually shows up after family gatherings or long catch-ups, especially if nothing obvious went wrong. I should be fine. Other people cope. It wasn't that bad. That word should is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because it ignores how the experience actually landed in your body. Another story sounds like this. I should be able to handle this. You might recognize that one. It usually shows up after family gatherings or long catch-ups, especially if nothing obvious went wrong. I should be fine. Other people cope. It wasn't that bad. That word should is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because it ignores how the experience actually landed in your body. Then there's the story that turns the blame inward. I must be overthinking it. This one tends to appear later, often in the quiet afterwards. You replay the conversation. You question your reactions. You analyze tone, pauses, expressions. And instead of trusting your experience, you interrogate it. But here's the thing that rarely gets said. Overthinking is often what happens after your system didn't feel settled. It's not the cause, it's the aftermath. Then there's the story that turns the blame inward. I must be overthinking it. This one tends to appear later, often in the quiet afterwards. You replay the conversation. You question your reactions. You analyze tone, pauses, expressions. During those conversations, they were holding back opinions, smoothing over disagreements, staying light when they felt serious, being agreeable to avoid friction. So the analysing later wasn't random. It was their mind trying to finish a conversation that hadn't felt complete. Another very common story goes like this. There must be something wrong with the relationship. Now sometimes, yes, relationships can be misaligned, but very often it's not that dramatic. It's not about cutting people off or creating distance. It's about noticing how much effort is required to stay comfortable in the interaction. Some relationships require very little self-management. Others require constant adjustment. Neither means the people involved are bad. It just means the fit has changed. What I want to gently suggest here is this. Most of the stories we tell ourselves about conversational exhaustion are attempts to make it go away. If we can explain it as weakness, oversensitivity, or overthinking, then we don't have to sit with the discomfort. But when you bypass the message, your body just speaks louder next time. Through fatigue, through withdrawal, through a need for silence. There's also a story people don't talk about much, but it's very common. It sounds like, I don't want to be difficult. This is especially true for people who are kind, thoughtful, or used to being the emotional stabilizer in a group. They don't want to. Set the tone. Shift the dynamic. Say they're tired, or ask for space. So instead, they absorb. And absorbing over time is incredibly draining. What's important to understand is that none of these stories are malicious. They're protective. They're ways the mind tries to keep things smooth, connected, and non-confrontational. But protection isn't the same as care. And when protection becomes automatic, it starts to cost you energy without you realizing. One of the reasons this kind of exhaustion is so hard to explain is because it doesn't come from a single moment. It builds quietly, gradually, almost politely, while the conversation is still happening. And because you're still smiling, still listening, still responding, you don't realize the cost until later. Let me slow this down. In a draining conversation, there is usually a subtle split that happens inside you. Part of you is present, listening, responding, engaging, and another part of you is watching, monitoring. You might notice yourself checking how you're coming across, adjusting your tone, choosing safer words, softening reactions, holding back thoughts. This isn't deception, it's self-management, and self-management uses energy. Most of the time, this isn't conscious. You're not thinking, I need to be careful here. It's more like a background process running quietly, like an app open on your phone that's draining the battery without you noticing. Most of the time, this isn't conscious. You're not thinking, I need to be careful here. It's more like a background process running quietly, like an app open on your phone that's draining the battery without you noticing. And instead of expressing that, you smooth the moment over. You stay agreeable. You keep things flowing. That choice, repeated over and over, adds up. Another example is when someone brings emotional weight into the conversation. Not overt distress, just a tone. They might complain repeatedly. Circle the same worry. Bring heaviness without real resolution. And you find yourself holding space. You're not just listening, you're containing. You regulate your reactions so they feel supported. That kind of presence is generous and it's tiring. What's important to understand is that your body is very good at tracking effort. Even when your mind tells you everything is fine, your nervous system notices increased tension, shallow breathing, held posture, alertness without rest, and it stores that information. So when the conversation ends, your system finally lets go. And that release feels like tiredness. There's also something else that often happens in these moments. You temporarily leave yourself, not dramatically, not completely, just enough. You stay connected to the other person, but slightly disconnected from your own inner signals. You might ignore the urge to change the subject, the need for a pause, the feeling that you've said enough, and later your body says, that was too much. This is why the exhaustion can feel confusing, because you weren't upset, you weren't triggered, you weren't arguing, you were adapting. And adaptation over time costs energy. I once heard someone describe this perfectly. They said, it's like being socially bilingual. You're translating yourself constantly, not because you're fake, but because you're considerate. And translation is tiring. This is also why you might notice a difference between conversations where you can think out loud and conversations where you have to be polished. Thinking out loud is spacious. Polished speaking is contained. Neither is wrong. But only one allows you to stay fully present without effort. The key thing I want you to hear in this section is this. Your exhaustion isn't random. It's not delayed emotion. It's not weakness. It's the natural result of sustained self-regulation. And once you see that, you stop being surprised by it. You start noticing it earlier. And that awareness is where change begins. One of the most confusing things about this kind of conversational exhaustion is that it often shows up later in life, not earlier. People will say, I never used to feel like this, or I used to handle these situations just fine. And because of that, they assume something has gone wrong. They think they've become less resilient, more fragile, less social, more difficult. But very often the opposite is true. What's actually happening is that you're more aware than you used to be. One of the most confusing things about this kind of conversational exhaustion is that it often shows up later in life, not earlier. People will say, I never used to feel like this, or I used to handle these situations just fine. And because of that, they assume something has gone wrong. They think they've become less resilient, more fragile, less social, more difficult. But very often the opposite is true. What's actually happening is that you're more aware than you used to be. Earlier in life, many of us are running on momentum. We're busy proving ourselves, fitting in, keeping things moving. We don't pause very often to notice how interactions land in the body. We push through tiredness. We override discomfort. We recover later, or not at all. And because we're distracted by activity, the cost doesn't always register consciously. But as you change, quietly, gradually, something shifts. You become less interested in performing, explaining yourself, maintaining roles that no longer fit. You start valuing honesty, simplicity, calm, ease. And with that change comes sensitivity, not emotional fragility, accuracy. You notice when something feels off sooner. You register effort more clearly. You become aware of the subtle ways you adapt. This is often the point where people say, "I feel like I've outgrown certain conversations." And that can sound harsh, but it's not about superiority. It's about alignment. Some conversations still match who you are now. Others are based on an older version of you. And stepping back into those older roles, even briefly, can feel exhausting. There's also something important to understand here. As awareness grows, tolerance for internal conflict decreases. When you were younger, you might have been able to laugh things off, ignore discomfort, stay agreeable for longer. Now your system doesn't want to split itself anymore. It wants coherence. So when your words, tone, and inner experience don't quite match, your body flags it. Through tiredness, through withdrawal, through a desire for quiet. This is why people are often surprised by how much they need recovery time now. They'll say, "I went out for lunch. Why do I feel like I need a day to recover?" It's not the lunch, it's the internal adjustment that happened during it. Another thing that changes as you grow is your relationship to silence. Earlier in life, silence can feel awkward, something to fill. Later, silence feels restorative. And when you've learned to appreciate quiet, conversations that require constant engagement, constant responsiveness, feel heavier. Not wrong, just heavier. There's also a deeper layer here. As people become more self-aware, they often become less interested in surface-level exchange. They want meaning, truth, depth. So when conversations stay polite but shallow, or emotionally loaded but unresolved, they leave a residue. Not because they were bad, but because they didn't nourish. What's important to say here is this. Noticing conversational exhaustion is not a sign that you're withdrawing from life. It's a sign that you're becoming more selective about how you participate. And selectivity is not rejection, it's discernment. If you've been wondering why you feel more affected by conversations lately, why your tolerance feels lower, why you need more space, it may simply be that you're listening more closely now to yourself And that's not something to fix, it's something to respect. There's something about holidays and family gatherings that brings this kind of tiredness into sharper focus. Even people who feel relatively steady the rest of the year often notice. They need more time alone. They feel drained more quickly. They're more aware of emotional undercurrents. They feel off afterwards without knowing why. And again, because these events are meant to be joyful or meaningful, people often feel confused or even guilty for feeling this way. They think, everyone's together. Why do I feel like this? Part of the reason holidays are so tiring is that they compress a lot of interaction into a short space of time. Multiple conversations, multiple roles, multiple expectations. You're not just one version of yourself. You're a daughter or son, a sibling, a friend, a partner, the reasonable one, the listener, the one who keeps things calm. And switching between roles, even gently, takes energy. Another reason holidays intensify this feeling is history. Family conversations don't start from scratch. They carry old dynamics, unspoken expectations, long-standing patterns, familiar emotional shortcuts. Even if no one mentions the past, it's present in tone, habit, and rhythm. Your body recognizes these patterns instantly, sometimes before your mind does. You might notice this if you feel yourself slipping into a familiar role very quickly. Perhaps you become quieter, or more accommodating, or more watchful. You're not doing this because you want to. You're doing it because the system remembers what worked before. And stepping into those old roles can feel oddly tiring, especially if you've grown beyond them. There's also the pressure of togetherness. Holidays often come with an unspoken message. Make the most of this. Enjoy every moment. Be present. And while that sounds lovely, it can create pressure. Because presence can't be forced. If you feel obligated to be emotionally available when you're already full, your system compensates, and that compensation drains you. Another subtle factor is lack of recovery time. During holidays, quiet moments are shorter. Transitions are faster. There's less space to reset between interactions. Normally, you might have time alone after a conversation, time to settle, time to breathe. During gatherings, conversations stack on top of each other, and the nervous system doesn't get a chance to discharge the effort. I once spoke to someone who said, "It's not that my family are difficult, it's that there's no space to stop being on." That's a very honest observation. You don't need conflict to feel tired. You just need prolonged engagement without pause. There's also something else worth naming. Holidays often heighten emotional contrast. You might be feeling reflective, sensitive, inward, ready to slow down, while the environment around you is busy, loud, socially demanding. That mismatch alone can be draining. Not because either state is wrong, but because they're not aligned. So if you notice yourself needing a walk, early nights, quiet mornings, time away from conversation during this season, that's not avoidance, it's regulation. Your system is trying to keep you steady in a socially intense environment. And here's something important to say, especially at this time of year. Needing space does not mean you love people less. It means you're listening to your capacity. And capacity changes with context. If holidays have been leaving you more tired than expected, you don't need to push yourself harder next time. You need to pace yourself more kindly, and that's what we'll talk about next. When people finally notice how drained they feel after certain conversations, their instinct is usually to fix it. That makes sense. We're taught that discomfort means something needs to be corrected. So people start trying things. They tell themselves, I just need better boundaries. Or, I need to be more confident. Or, I need to stop caring so much. And while those ideas sound reasonable, they often create a new problem, because they turn something subtle into something forceful. One very common response is to harden. People decide they'll be more guarded, less open, more distant. They reduce contact. They withdraw emotionally. They stay polite but detached. And while this might reduce immediate exhaustion, it often creates a different kind of tiredness. The tiredness of disconnection. Because most people don't actually want less connection. They want easier connection. Another approach people try is self-discipline. They tell themselves, just get through it. Don't be so affected. Other people manage. So they override their signals. They push through tiredness. They ignore the need for pause. They stay longer than they should. And the cost shows up later in deeper exhaustion, irritability, or withdrawal. Some people try positivity. They reframe. They tell themselves to be grateful. They focus on the good. And while gratitude has its place, it doesn't restore energy that was spent managing yourself. You can be grateful and tired at the same time. Those states don't cancel each other out. Another very common attempt is analysis. People dissect conversations. What did they mean by that? Why did I react that way? What should I do differently next time? And again, analysis isn't wrong, but when it replaces rest, it prolongs the drain, because the system is still activated. What all of these attempts have in common is this. They treat exhaustion as a problem to solve rather than a message to respond to. And when you argue with the message, your body keeps sending it. Here's the quieter truth that rarely gets said. You don't fix conversational exhaustion by changing who you are. You fix it by changing how much of yourself you give without noticing. And that requires awareness, not force. There's also something very kind that needs to be said here. If you've tried to toughen up, withdraw, reframe, or analyze your way out of this, it doesn't mean you failed. It means you were trying to care for yourself with the tools you had. Those tools just weren't designed for something this subtle. What actually helps is not a dramatic shift. It's a series of small internal permissions. Permission to pause, be brief, change the subject, take space, end conversations earlier, recover without guilt. None of these require confrontation. None of them require explanation. They require self-trust. When people stop trying to fix this experience, something interesting happens. The tiredness doesn't vanish overnight, but it stops feeling mysterious. And when something stops feeling mysterious, it stops feeling threatening. That's where the real change begins. Not in becoming stronger or tougher, but in becoming more attuned. So if hardening doesn't help, and pushing through doesn't help, and analyzing doesn't help, what does? The answer is much quieter than most people expect. It starts with noticing earlier, not fixing, not correcting, just noticing. The first thing that genuinely helps is learning the early signs. For many people, the tiredness doesn't appear suddenly. It whispers first. It might show up as a slight tightening in the shoulders, a change in breathing, a sense of wanting the conversation to move on, a feeling of being on rather than present. These are not problems, they're signals. And when you catch them early, you can respond gently instead of compensating unconsciously. One simple shift is allowing yourself to be less verbally available, not rude, not distant, just less explanatory. You don't have to fill every pause. You don't have to justify every thought. You don't have to elaborate unless you want to. Letting sentences end where they naturally want to end saves an enormous amount of energy. Another quiet shift is releasing the need to manage the other person's experience. This one takes practice. If someone seems disappointed, distracted, or preoccupied, you don't have to fix that. You can stay kind without becoming responsible. Often, exhaustion comes from carrying emotions that aren't yours. There's also something very grounding about changing your physical orientation. This sounds simple, but it's powerful. If you're sitting, adjust your posture. If you're standing, shift your weight. If you can, take a few slower breaths. You're not doing this to relax the conversation. You're doing it to stay inhabited. Sometimes what helps most is giving yourself permission to disengage slightly, not emotionally withdrawing, just easing back from full participation. You might listen more than speak, or speak less than you normally would. That small recalibration can preserve energy without anyone noticing. Another thing that helps is letting go of conversational goals. Many people go into interactions unconsciously trying to be understood, be liked, be helpful, be pleasant. Those goals create pressure. When you release them, conversations become lighter. You're no longer trying to arrive somewhere. You're just present. One of the most helpful things you can do is allow yourself to end conversations earlier than you think you should. This doesn't require explanation. You don't need a perfect exit. You don't need a reason that sounds legitimate. I'm going to get some air. I need a moment. I'm going to step away for a bit. These are not failures. their maintenance. And then there's what you do after. After a draining conversation, your system needs closure, not analysis. Quiet, stillness, neutrality, no replaying, no fixing, no self-judgment, just return. I want to share a small story here. Someone once told me that after certain social events, they'd always feel unsettled, not upset, just ungrounded. They assumed they needed to understand why. But what actually helped was something much simpler. They stopped rushing back into stimulation. They'd sit quietly, sometimes in the car, sometimes at home, 10 minutes, no phone, no music. And slowly, their system learned that it didn't need to stay alert anymore. The exhaustion softened. What's important to remember is this: you don't need to become less sensitive. You need to become more responsive to yourself. Sensitivity paired with awareness becomes discernment. And discernment is not draining, it's stabilizing. For many people, the hardest part doesn't happen during the conversation. It happens afterwards. They finally get a moment alone, and instead of resting, something else appears: guilt. They think, why do I need space? Why can't I just enjoy people? Why do I feel like this when nothing bad happened? And without realizing it, they start draining themselves all over again. Guilt is particularly powerful because it sounds reasonable. It disguises itself as self-awareness, as responsibility, as kindness. But in this context, guilt is usually just another way of ignoring your limits. A very common thought people have after draining conversations is, I shouldn't feel like this. That one sentence does a lot of damage because it turns a physical and emotional response into a personal failing. Instead of resting, you argue with yourself. Instead of settling, you stay activated. There's something important to understand about recovery. Recovery is not indulgence, it's regulation. Your nervous system doesn't recover because you deserve it. It recovers because it needs to. And when recovery is delayed by guilt, exhaustion deepens. Many people feel guilty because they equate needing space with rejecting others. But those are not the same thing. You can value connection and need solitude. You can enjoy people and need time away. You can care deeply and reach your limit. These things are not opposites. I once heard someone say, I feel bad needing quiet after seeing my family, like I'm ungrateful. But gratitude doesn't refill capacity, rest does. Another layer of guilt comes from comparison. People notice others socializing effortlessly, staying late, chatting easily, and they think, what's wrong with me? What they don't see is what it costs others or doesn't. Capacity is not universal. Sensitivity is not evenly distributed. Awareness changes what you notice. And none of that is a defect. There's also guilt around not processing the conversation. People think they need to understand why they're tired. So they replay it, they analyze it, they try to extract meaning. But often, the most healing thing you can do is let the experience pass without interrogation. Not everything needs to be understood to be released. One of the kindest things you can say to yourself after a draining conversation is, "That took something out of me." No judgment, no story, just acknowledgement. That sentence alone allows the body to soften. Recovery doesn't need to be elaborate. It might be sitting in silence, a warm drink, a slow walk, an early night. Small things. What matters is not what you do. It's that you do it without self-criticism. When guilt loosens its grip, recovery becomes efficient. You don't spiral. You don't withdraw for days. You don't resent future interactions. You simply reset. And the next conversation feels lighter as a result. Once you stop fighting the tiredness, once you stop fixing it, once you stop judging it, something changes. It starts to make sense, not intellectually, intuitively. This kind of exhaustion isn't telling you to withdraw from people. It's not telling you to toughen up. And it's not telling you that you're antisocial. It's telling you something much quieter. You are no longer meant to give yourself away without noticing. For a long time, many people survive by adapting. They read the room, they adjust, they keep things smooth. That skill is useful, sometimes necessary. But at a certain point, adaptation becomes overextension, and your system starts asking for a different way of relating. This tiredness is not asking you to build walls. It's asking you to stay inside yourself while you connect, to speak when it's true, to pause when it's not, to listen without absorbing. That's not detachment, that's integrity. There's a maturity to this stage of life that often goes unrecognized. It's the stage where you value depth over performance, you prefer ease over approval, you choose clarity over explanation, and conversations that don't allow for that feel heavy. Not because they're wrong, but because they require you to split yourself. What your tiredness is really pointing to is this: you don't need more social skills. You don't need better coping strategies. You need conversations that allow you to be whole. This doesn't mean your circle needs to shrink dramatically. It means it needs to become more honest, more spacious, more forgiving of silence. You might notice that with certain people you come alive. You leave feeling grounded, expanded, clear. And with others you leave feeling diminished. Not harmed, just thinned out. That contrast is information. Not about who to keep or discard, but about how much of yourself you bring forward in each space. There's a very gentle freedom that comes when you accept this. You stop expecting every interaction to meet you deeply. You stop overgiving where depth isn't possible. You stop blaming yourself for needing space. And because you're no longer draining yourself unknowingly, you actually become more present when it matters. This is often the moment when people realize, I'm not becoming less social. I'm becoming more selective and kinder. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling this way. You're not broken. You're not withdrawing from life. You're refining how you participate in it. Once you understand what this tiredness is telling you, there can be a temptation to overcorrect. People think, right, I'll just avoid these situations. Or, I'll keep my distance from now on. That's understandable, but it's not what this awareness is asking for. This stage of understanding isn't about withdrawal. It's about modulation. Learning how much of yourself to bring into different spaces and allowing that amount to change without guilt. You don't need to show up the same way everywhere. Some spaces invite depth, some invite lightness, some are transitional. And when you stop expecting every interaction to meet you fully, you stop overgiving by default. Moving forward gently means giving yourself permission to arrive slowly, leave early, be quiet without apology, listen without fixing, speak without over-explaining. These are not defensive behaviors, they're self-respect. It also means trusting yourself in the moment. If something feels like enough, it probably is. If you feel your energy dipping, that's not a failure of stamina, it's timing. One of the most helpful shifts people make at this stage is releasing the idea that they need to be consistent. You're allowed to have different capacities on different days. You're allowed to feel open one moment and inward the next. That flexibility is health, not instability. There's a quiet confidence that comes with this. You stop needing to explain why you're tired. You stop negotiating your need for space. You stop apologizing for your rhythm. And because you're no longer leaking energy unconsciously, your interactions become cleaner, shorter sometimes, but more real. If you think back over this whole conversation, you might notice something important. Nothing here required confrontation. Nothing required cutting people off. Nothing required changing who you are. It just required listening, earlier and more kindly, and often that's enough. If you've been feeling drained after certain conversations, especially lately, there's nothing wrong with you. Your system is paying attention, and learning to honor that attention is one of the most stabilizing things you can do. If you found this helpful, you're welcome to stay. These are the kinds of conversations we take our time with here.